Hello, my friend. On today's episode, I'm speaking with my man, Pete, and we're talking about the things that we see all of you as gym owners overthinking the most. The places where we see many of you getting stuck in analysis paralysis and just not moving the ball forward because you're just thinking about stuff for too long. We share that list and a few tips for how to overcome it. So if that sounds like something you suffer from, it's a great episode for you. So keep on listening. Hello, fitness business nerds. What's up? Welcome to another episode of the Business for Unicorns podcast. I'm back again with Pete. Hello, my friend.
Hi, I'm showing up for this one with a smile on my face because you made me laugh as we were hitting play or record.
Just trying to sabotage. Before we dive into today's topic, which I'm really excited about, I want to just do a quick little shout out about websites. So all of you probably listening have a website. And for many of you, I say this with love, it probably stinks. It's probably not doing a very good job of converting people who land on it to a next step. It's not doing a very good job of selling your low barrier offer. It's not doing a very good job of making it easy for you to capture information from people who land on your website. And we specifically partner with our friends over at Kilo because they build websites that do all of those things. And we think you should go use them. You go to usekilo.com, let them know you're listening to this podcast and you came from Business for Unicorns. They'll take good care of you, offer you some discounts, and they'll build you a fantastic website that not only looks good, but it functions well for its primary purpose, which is to convert visitors to leads. So go check them out, improve your website, and get more leads, friends. Let's pivot to today's topic. Today's topic is all about things that Pete and I think all of you are overthinking. And this topic came up because I think it was a kind of a theme in some of your reflections on calls with Unicorn Center members recently, Pete. So you just want to talk a little bit about how we got to this topic?
Well, we're overthinking things all the time, myself included.
Yes.
But there are definitely some trends that I'm seeing in calls continuously. The one specifically that spurned me to put this on a possible conversation agenda was the fact that I noticed a number of clients who are making a transition away from personal training into some iteration of small group or semi-private or anything that we're calling it training. They were dragging their heels a little bit because they were caught up on details like terminology. And while I agree the terminology is incredibly important as it relates to how we talk to our potential clients, I think it's fairly irrelevant when it comes to these internal changes. No one in your community is going to choose not to stay with you because you called it semi-private training and not small group personal training. Now, sure, there are arguments to be made for every label. And for the record, we are phasing out the term semi-private in our facility and leaning in to small group personal training, but it's not changing the client experience in any capacity. And if that terminology is what's slowing someone down from pulling the trigger on just making the move and ripping the Band-Aid off, then I would say they are either A, overthinking, or B, intentionally avoiding change. And so that was the impetus for me kind of throwing the conversation out there.
Yeah, totally. I love that one. I think you're so right. So often when people are in the midst of or just starting a change project, they will get stuck in this analysis paralysis. We're just thinking about it. And, I think, at least my understanding of like what's actually going on there is that it's a coping mechanism. When people are nervous and fearful about change, about making the wrong decision, about pissing people off, they'll just think about it more to avoid taking any action. And that thinking about it cycle protects them from having to do anything because thinking is free. Can't get in much trouble for the thinking, but it's the talking and acting and making the change that I think people are nervous about. So I think, if we're going to dive into this conversation, I want to start with saying like that is normal. We all do it, including Pete and I. We'll sit in analysis paralysis and just think about stuff for too long. And it's important for us to recognize that we're doing that because we're nervous often. They're afraid of what's around the corner, and that's okay. You just need to talk it out with somebody. And I think it's the number one thing that helps me get out of that kind of over analyzing process is just get into conversation, like get out of my own head, maybe get into a journal or get into conversation with you, Pete, or Fisher, or Ben, whoever, or, or a client or a team member. And as soon as you can get into a conversation about it, the problem and the fear starts to subside and make sense of itself. But I think, yeah, this is a phenomenon. We could probably list a million ways that we see people overthinking, but we're going to stick to the most common ones today. So aside from changing a service and a name, what else do you see people overthinking?
Well, in that same vein, I think that most of us, not you specifically, not you and Fisher, not our guy James Pratt or some of the big operations in Unicorn Society, but most of us have a small enough active client roster that communicating change can and should happen in a one-on-one format, often face to face. And
Yeah.
it's pretty easy for us to articulate an adjustment. If we're making a move from one-on-one to a 3-to-1 or 4-to-1 or 5-to-1, or maybe we're moving from 4-to-1 to 5-to-1 client to coach ratio, and we're worried that someone's going to think that this is the end of the world. Well, we can sell it pretty effectively face to face in the warm up area. And anyone who says, well, I'm worried about how the client will receive this because you changed the terminology on your website, is lying to themselves, because nobody who currently trains with Mark Fisher Fitness is just scrolling through markfisherfitness.com, seeing what's new on the site. Literally none
No,
of them. And so
nobody.
new clients, people who find our sites, don't have any familiarity with the way things used to be done, which is why when we increase prices, the increase happens effective immediately because they didn't know what, with people who haven't been in before. And so I think that we need to just stop overthinking the way people are going to receive the information in digital format when we know with absolute certainty that we can put it on their radar face to face.
Yeah.
To
I think it's
jump
huge.
from there,
It does a great job of like de-escalating any tension, because you kind of like take people's temperature, right? You have the conversation face to face on the training floor. Hey, we're thinking about doing this. We're going to call it this. We're going to change our rates to this. What's your reaction to that, right? You can kind of start to test it out and plant seeds. And I think that's a great way to recognize, listen, people are not going to go crazy. It's going to be okay. Face to face, it's very easy to kind of to get that sense of how might this change go. And I'm going to give you the confidence to move faster into that change. So I think it's a great tip, Pete.
I'm interested in hearing how you do it at scale. Because like I said earlier, your active client roster is probably in the range of 3x what mine is. And the volume you do is such that across the board face-to-face interaction would be prohibitive. So
Yeah.
do you aspire for a certain percentage of your community to have these conversations in person, or what's the plan of
Yeah.
attack?
It's a good question. Yeah. So this could be actually a whole nother podcast. It's like how to manage these change projects. But but I think in a nutshell, I think we do a lot of the same things you do, right? So our version of kind of planting the seed and taking people's temperatures, sometimes we'll actually do a pilot program of the change, right? So for example, if we're changing our services, we did, coming out of COVID, we went from like 3-on-1 to 6-on-1, and we did a pilot. We did a small group of people trying out that new way of doing things. And doing that, people started talking, right? The word got out that we were testing this thing and trying this thing. And people got the idea planted before we even told them that it might be coming, before we told them whether it was a green light or a red light as a project. It started to get them familiar with the idea, right? So as the first step, we definitely planted some seeds and started taking people's temperatures. The pilot also helped us get our shit together, so that when we did decide to move in that direction, we were sure that we knew how to do it. We sure that we wanted to do it, that we knew how to do it. We could change the programming. We could get the coaches prepared to work 6-on-1 instead of 3-on-1. And then we start the formal communications, which has to be kind of layered. And we want to make sure that we always, in those communications, center the what and the why. Right? So here's what we plan to do, and here's why we think making this change is going to serve all of you, our dear beloved clients, as well as serve us and our team. And so I think making sure that we communicate that, and the way that we try and get kind of quote FaceTime in those communications. I still do this in Business of Unicorns. We would often send a video message in an email. So we'd write a long email with the what and the why, but we'd also send a video so people could see our faces, hear our tone, hear our humanity, hear our energy. So all of that made a big difference in how the message landed for people, because they could see, Mark talking about it. And that makes a big difference. And then there's follow up, and there's going to be some percentage of people that there's, friction in the change. So all of that is, I think, pretty par for the course. But I think it's that beginning prep that you do, that kind of planting the seeds, building up our confidence in the change, starting to let the community know that something's coming and starts to bubble up from under the surface, and then having the communication roll out, be really thorough, where they can kind of see our energy and tone about the change. So they know we're not worried. You shouldn't be either. Right? Or as opposed to a cold email without any tone, it's really hard to interpret. And they can
Yep.
kind of catastrophize very easily the change that they're reading about. But it's harder when Mark's making a video about it and making jokes. It's harder to catastrophize that kind of message.
Sure.
Did I answer
You just
did I
said
answer your
something
question?
that made me realize there might be a whole other podcast and things we're underthinking, because you mentioned how you test run this,
Yeah.
and I run into a shocking amount of people who conclude that they want to make serious change
Mm.
and they just make it without trying
Yep.
it. So the
Yeah.
person who's like been doing one-on-one personal training for 5 years, and all of a sudden they're like, now we are a small group, and they don't give it a trial run. They just roll it out overnight, and they don't realize that their programming
Mm.
strategy needs to change a little bit. The way that they
Yeah.
utilize the equipment in the gym needs to change a little bit. And
Yeah.
what happens is they create this absolute train wreck of miscommunication on managing expectations for duration of sessions and what the client experience should feel like, because they just take this like we'll figure it out approach to the shift,
Yeah.
because they heard us say on a podcast like, oh, just tear the band-aid off as it relates to something different, and they tear that band-aid
Totally.
off and then there's blood everywhere. And so
Yeah.
that
100%.
that
Well, I think,
topic could
that's
be
the thing
another day.
is we would both agree that there are plenty of things you should rip off the Band-Aid for, right? That is a relevant and necessary approach for a lot of things. And there's some Band-Aids that have to come off slow, right?
Yep.
They're more like casts, right? Like you have to slowly saw it off your arm. And I think, when it comes to change projects, which I agree, we should just have a whole other podcast about. But the last thing I'll say about it is this, is that one of the, and this is true in all the research that I've done in my graduate studies and now PhD studies, when it comes to change in businesses, one of the number one reasons why change projects fail is that no one assessed everyone's readiness for the change. No one
Mhm.
took time before steamrolling the change out to be like, is everyone ready for this? Are we as a team who's going to lead this change ready for this? Do we know what we're doing? Have we tested our ideas? Are we all on the same page about what change is that we want to make? And then how do we get our people ready for the change? How do we start getting them thinking that change is good and we have some good ideas? How do we test that with them? And so I think there's a whole another podcast there, but I think people both over and underthink change, right?
Yep.
They overthink it and then change never comes, or they underthink it and they just roll out a disaster, right? Both ends of that spectrum are shit. Right?
Yep. Yep.
We're looking for somewhere in the middle of like an appropriate amount of planning and consideration without sitting in analysis paralysis for months. So like everything, moderation is really the key here. Let's go back to our list. What are other things that we know people are consistently overthinking?
Well, you and I have harped on this one in the past, so I'm not going to go into it in too much depth. But I think everybody overthinks their presumed client reactions to pricing increases.
Yeah.
And the example I'll give you is that we did one on June 1st. We notified somewhere in the vicinity of 180 to 200 active clients. And here we are. It's Halloween that we're recording this. I'm still waiting for my first response. Literally nobody pushed back. I got a handful of responses. I take that back. I probably got 2 to 3 responses who were like, oh, I figured this was coming. It's been too long. And then the rest was radio silence, and those credit cards stayed on file and kept running. So if there's hesitation because there's going to be a panic move and you're raising your prices by, say, sub 10%, and you haven't done it inside of the last calendar year, then I think you're overthinking it.
Yeah. 100%. And for those of you who are thinking about a rate change, go listen to our past podcasts. We've done probably a few on the topic of rate changes, but I think you're 100% right, Pete. It's like, that's a rip off the Band-Aid. Like if you haven't done a rate change in a year, it's less than 10%. It's time to do it. There's nothing else to think about. Right? It's just time. Yeah. I'll throw one out. And I want to preface this by saying that I feel like I harp on this topic maybe too much on this podcast. So I might give a few disclaimers, but one of the things I see are many Unicorns members overthinking constantly is program design, program design. And here's the thing: I want to make sure I say on this podcast, I fully respect and appreciate and honor amazing program designers, and people who are really amazing at that are incredible. And it takes years and years of expertise and practice and experience to be able to create amazing programs for clients. So, like, let me just say, like, I appreciate the skill and the craft of program design, but from a business systems perspective, I see so many gym owners making such friggin' complicated program design systems. I mean, we have some Unicorns members who I won't name, but you know who you are, and I love you, but you're making like entire university level 4-year college programs out of your program design process. It's just so complicated. You don't need everyone on your team to have a 4-year degree in kinesiology and a master's degree in physical therapy to be able to interact with your programming. Like, it doesn't need to be that complicated, especially for almost all of you listening, serve a general population audience. And for those of you who work in sports performance, you mostly work with youth athletes, right? We're not talking about almost any of you listening working with pro or semi-pro athletes, right? Which is when I think it probably does need to get complicated enough that people got some degrees and a decade of experience. But for most of you, it should be dead simple. It should be dead simple. I know that sounds maybe blasphemous coming from someone who's not a trainer. So I want to make sure I couch that with, like, I respect all of your certs and your degrees, and your business is too complicated if your program design process requires so much energy and effort all the time. It's just weighing you down. Yeah. Did I give enough disclaimers to get away with that?
Yeah, I don't think there's such a thing as harping on this too much, though. And I think I'm part of the problem. My business is part of the problem because we spent a significant chunk of the 17 plus years we've been doing this hammering home this mindset that we do individualized program design. But the disclaimer I would give is that if you strip down our program to the elite athlete you mentioned, who you said may or may not require kind of that like elite level of program design skills, if you take their program and you strip it down to the 4 foundational core principles, it looks exactly like our strength camp program. Like, it actually is the meat and potatoes, the basics. So the way that our programming complexities get introduced with our higher level athletes is really more in like the corrective stuff, or it's kind of like the complementary pieces. It's the additional seasoning that gets thrown into these things because of the unique demands of the sport these people are playing. But if you really can see through the fluff, the extras, you'll realize that the programming strategy is actually very similar. Like, they're still using the same trap bars. They're still doing lunges with the same dumbbells. It's just that we don't have a professional athlete making $10+ million a year who comes in looking for the 55-minute training session with the group warm-up. They have some very specific needs. And so if you really think about it, we're building the specific needs on top of the 55-minute session. And so, yeah, they might be around for 2 hours and they might be doing a lot of arm care and they might be doing a lot of, sports specific, like they're throwing med balls in a way that makes sense for a baseball player, things like that. Sure, that stuff's layered on top of it, but program design is basic in its most true form. And that's coming from a guy who doesn't design programs in our operation. So take what you will.
I know. You can all come at us. You can all come at us in the comments. It's fine. But, the reality is I've seen for 12 years now at Mark Fisher Fitness how our programming has stayed very meat and potatoes. When we've had, thousands of people go through our classes where they just use kettlebells and body weight and resistance bands. That's it. And even our small group personal training area is not full of a million toys. Our exercise library stays pretty lean, right? It's not that complicated. And we've been very successful with that. People still feel like they're getting a really great workout, a great experience that meets them where they're at without having it be overly freaking complicated. And so, I think we could probably talk more about this, and I can talk more about it with Fisher and Ben, because I know they're the ones more and Wheels are more intricately involved in program design conversations. They can add some more color here, but it's one I'm pretty confident I can say I see almost everyone in Unicorn Society at some point overthinking that system in their business of how programs get designed and implemented, and it just needs to be simpler. It just needs to be simpler. Yeah. I know there's another one that we both agreed on before filming this, which was we both agreed that people are almost always overthinking their social media strategy. Yeah. Say more about that one.
Yeah. I mean, I'm probably just speaking to myself to a degree. Um, those of us who sit home thinking that the consumer on the other end of our content strategy is saying, why did they use that font? Or I don't like the lighting in that post. That person is few and far between. And the reality is we just need to show up and check the box and put a lot
Yes.
out there and be top of mind as much as possible, as opposed to sitting home trying to craft the most flawless Canva template we
Mm,
can. And many posts of mine have sat on the shelf for longer than they should have because I was too concerned with the aesthetics. And
yeah.
so again, I'm speaking to myself here, but gym owners make this mistake all the time as well. They're in search of perfection that doesn't exist, and it's slowing down their ability to stay on radars.
Yeah, it's huge. I'm so guilty of this too, Pete. I mean, honestly, anyone who's been following Business of Unicorns for a while will know that, like, I used to do some blog posts for a few years when Mark and I first started Business of Unicorns, but then I didn't really create much content for a while because I was in the same position. I was just like, well, what exactly do people want from me? How do I create, how to make great video? It wasn't until I started doing this podcast where I was like, oh, it can just be messy. Like we hardly edit these podcasts at all. Once in a while, when we say really dumb things, we'll take it out. But for the most part, this is just we get on and we talk, and it's messy. Like, we do a little bit of talking about what we're going to talk about. And certainly when I have guests, I do a little bit of planning, but not a ton. And it took me a while to be okay with this kind of ready, fire, aim. And what I learned is exactly what you said, Pete, which is like the consistency is almost more important than the content. Like, sure, I hope to put out useful bits of information that will resonate with all of you. And same thing for MFF. And I know Mark does a really great job of sending out emails, and our team does a great job of putting out social media content. But we really do try to prioritize consistency above all else. I'd rather have like a really short 10-minute okay podcast than to miss one of our posts. And we post twice a week this podcast now, and so it's not it's a lot of content, but I'm not agonizing over every episode. Maybe some of you think I should more, which is a fine opinion to have. But the reality is I think Pete and I would both agree that most of you listening probably should just put out twice as much content and care a little less about it being perfect.
Yeah, well, look at it this way. I'd say that you and I get out to a fair amount of industry specific events, maybe me a little more so as you pursue a PhD. But I get a lot of feedback on the podcast, and it's always about the subject matter. I have never once had someone say to me, I noticed that Keeler hooked you up with a 1080p camera, or, I really wanted to tell you that the sound quality has been great on the podcast lately. That does not happen. But people will specifically reference stories that we told. They will specifically reference tactics that we shared. And the quality of the delivery on the platform is pretty irrelevant to those people. They're just here to learn. And so stop overthinking it is where we'll leave it.
Stop overthinking and just fucking do it. Just do it. Well, let's leave it there, my friends. I think we covered a lot of bases here. I think we talked a little bit about what overthinking is and why we do it. It's okay. We all do it. And there's got to be some dance you do with yourself to say, okay, just get out of my own way and put something out there. Just move the ball forward and learn by doing. And I think maybe we'll follow this up with another podcast of things people are not thinking enough about. We started to talk a little bit about that because I think planning and change projects can go in both directions, but I think that'd be a good follow-up to this is like start thinking more about some other things. Anything you want to say to wrap up this one?
Oh no, I got to start brainstorming that next one because I have a feeling that's what you're coming at me with next week.
Yeah, 100%. We're going to do that next. I can already think of a few.
Yeah, well, unlike your advice earlier, I'm going to show up with a plan in place for that one. I'm going to overthink this one.
Good. That's awesome. All right. Well, thanks for a great conversation, Pete. And listeners, thank you for listening. If you love this podcast, please, please, please leave us a 5-star review everywhere that you listen to your podcast. It really does help us find other folks out in the world who need this brilliant advice. And if you're in the business of looking for a new website, and many of you probably should, go to usekilo.com and check out our friends' amazing service over there. See you on the next one, Pete.
Take care, Michael.